Hello, and welcome to the Brave New Weed podcast. And now, here's your host, Joe Dolce.
Matthew, I have a cold today. Sorry I sound so fuzzy.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that, Joe. It doesn't sound that bad from my side, though, so I think you're doing all right.
That's great. Listen, we had a lot of feedback. I want to start right in. We had a lot of feedback on our last episode with Julie Holland, as well as some of the news items we brought up. And before we talk about this week's episode, I want to just address one thing that occurred. We got a lot of feedback on the idea of Malcolm Gladwell taking a lot of exception to the use of legalization of cannabis. I sort of dismissed it, but a lot of listeners wrote back saying, Joe, pay attention. This man is very powerful and smart and should be taken seriously. And one listener, a guy named Kirk Biglioni, wrote to me and said, listen, he is saying that cannabis is so different now because it's so much more powerful. He's actually saying that it's a different plant that has been used historically. And I went back and I listened to what Gladwell was saying, thanks to Kurt. And I think he is right that I was too glib about this. The concern is that, if somebody like Malcolm isn't properly educated about cannabis, that this could cause another wave of fear and sort of politicization in a way that could really slow down the way things are going. And I have to just say for the record that Malcolm is misinformed. Yes, there is more THC in cannabis, but everybody knows who uses it or in any way is that you can use less of it to achieve the same effect. It's entirely possible to microdose with a high THC product. And Kurt, in his note to me, said, there's a company called Dosist out of California, and they make a vape pen. And the oil is like 60% THC, but you can administer a 1.2 milligram dose of THC with every inhale, and that's a tiny inhale. So just want to say I want to invite Malcolm onto the show. I want to discuss this with him. If anybody knows Malcolm Gladwell, please tell him that the clarion call has been put out and that we would love to talk to him.
Yeah, I think you do bring up a good point, Joe, which is, you can brew whiskey to be 40% alcohol. You can brew certain extracts of alcohol to be in the 80% range, like if you're talking about Everclear or corn grain alcohol. But that doesn't mean you have to drink the whole bottle, right?
Right, exactly.
And I think that education, you're absolutely right. It's us being educated on that fact, and the things that we've been raised with alcohol, relearning that for THC and for cannabis, and understanding that there is a variety of strengths to these products, and we need to not be overdosing, regardless of what we might have in our hands.
I prefer the term overindulging to overdosing. Overdosing is a freighted word, Matthew, and I worry about it because, there really has, again, I'll say it again, as I've said many times, there's never been one reported death from overdose.
Yeah, no, don't get me wrong. I'm not suggesting that. I probably overdosed on Thanksgiving turkey this year, but I'm still here. I'm still kicking, so.
I'm glad to hear it. So listen, that's that. This week we have two great interviews, actually. I just want to tease them before we talk about the news. One is my favorite new cookbook called Edibles, which is actually a low-dose cookbook for making incredible foods with cannabis. I think the beauty of it is that you can cook and still get to dessert with the recipes. And the second is a fantastic interview with Stephen Kotler. Stephen is the co-author of Stealing Fire, one of my favorite books of the year, certainly of all time. And he talks about some amazing things, again, mostly optimizing performance by using cannabis and the future of this. So we will talk about that very shortly. In the meantime, what's new in the world?
Joe, I only really have one piece of interesting news to discuss with you today, and that is the it's all over. It's plastered on the BBC. It's plastered on the Guardian. That Altria, the makers of Marlboro cigarettes, are now formally and publicly in talks about a potential large takeover level investment of the Canadian cannabis producer Cronos.
You know, I have to say, I'm not really surprised. I think it's the first of many of these things that's going to happen. I think, you know, people have long been talking about the advent of marijuana, and it looks like we're close to marijuana. We're getting ever closer. I mean, it's not a big surprise that these companies that have distribution networks and are seeing tobacco sales certainly fall off in the West by a huge percentage. What did you tell me?
That's absolutely right. Actually, Altria's public shares are down more than 20% over the last year. And the current estimates of United States federal data show that 14% of adults in the United States smoke cigarettes, which is the lowest level ever since they started keeping track.
Well, I have to say, it's a really good bit of news. So I know a lot of these cigarette companies, their game plan is to become, instead of cigarette companies, in the West at least, there'll still be cigarette companies in the developing world, but in the West they're going to become things called nicotine delivery companies. So they're going to be using a lot of the technology that is currently out there. I think, isn't Altria also a stakeholder in Juul?
That's actually not accurate. They do own a subsidiary called Newmark, which is an e-cigarette company, but they are in talks right now to take a minority stake of Juul Labs, somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 40% ownership of the company. So it's not firm yet, but they are definitely floating money around and diversifying their product options.
I can't say I'm surprised, and
they're not alone in this as well. The news leading up to this also talks about a London-based tobacco company, Imperial Brands, which has taken an undisclosed stake in Oxford Cannabinoid, which is a UK-based cannabis company. And then, of course, we've talked before about Constellation Brands. That's an alcohol distribution company that has invested $3.8 billion in Canopy Growth. And also Coca-Cola has dipped its toes into the game and is looking for potential alliances to help it produce CBD Coke.
I think we just all have to be very diligent. We have to keep our eyes on the ball. And these things this is going to happen. This is capitalism.
Know what you're buying, folks. Know what you're buying. Buy local, support local, smoke local.
Exactly.
Joe and I will continue to publish every episode of the Brave New Weed podcast for free for you, our listeners. But we could always use your support. If you've got a little extra change rattling around in your pocket, you can cruise over to patreon.com/bravenewweed and become a supporter of the show. Everything that you'd pledge to support helps us to increase the guests that we can have on the show, even eventually the frequency of the show. And we have a great set of rewards out there, including copies of Joe's book, invites to special events that we will do in New York City, all sorts of fun things. So if you're enjoying the podcast and you would like to support us, visit patreon.com/bravenewweed today.
So our first cast today is with the authors of Edibles, Small Bites for the Cannabis Kitchen. This is Stephanie Hua and Coreen Carroll. These two women have been making incredible edibles out of San Francisco for many years now. Both are experienced cooks. Coreen runs a fantastic thing called the Cannaisseur series, which has a public meal every month or so that goes on for 4 or 5 hours, all infused with cannabis, with different pairings of different strains, with different foods. It's an amazing thing. Stephanie's been a chef for many, many years, and they have created a book that I love because it's low-dose cooking. So let's hear what they have to say. Also, by the way, I just want to say, this is a great gift for Christmas, for the holidays, for your cannabis-inclined loved ones.
Good morning, Joe. How are you?
Thanks for talking. Welcome to you to being on the podcast. I have to say, your book is is very beautiful. Maybe it's the most beautiful cookbook on cannabis I've seen.
Thank you.
you.
That means a lot.
You guys did it. Congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah. Long
So
enough.
Stephanie, I know you two both from Meadow, which is a startup in San Francisco. And every time I'm there, I see one or both of you in the kitchen there, cooking, preparing, testing. So I presume this was the culmination of all of that cooking, prepping, and testing, correct?
Yes, exactly. We put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, and did a lot of testing to get these recipes to where we were happy with them. And so we're super
Blood,
excited.
sweat, tears, cannabis oil, perhaps?
Blood, sweat, and tears are in the recipe. It just is what it took to make them.
Sweat and cannabis by the end of it.
So what distinguishes this book from the many cannabis cookbooks that have come out in the last few years?
Sure, yeah. So the real focus of this book, Coreen and I both come from a food background, and so we really wanted every recipe to be absolutely delicious. And so there really is a big focus on how Coreen and I cook and how we eat and how we like to entertain. And so I think a big differentiation factor is really the culinary focus behind this cookbook. We also really wanted to focus it on low dosage. So especially with a lot of people who are newer to cannabis coming into the market now and wanting to experiment with edibles and with cooking with cannabis, we wanted to really make sure that no one would overdo it. And so we paid a lot of attention to dosing each recipe so that they would be roughly about 5 milligrams of THC per serving. So the whole book kind of centers around this formulation of low dose, small bites.
In other words, you can use your recipes and still get to desserts sitting or standing up?
Exactly. That's the whole point. Being able to have multiple.
So Stephanie, you're a chef, and Coreen, you're a chef also, but you do a very interesting enterprise in San Francisco. Will you tell our listeners what the Cannaisseur series is, please?
Sure. So the Cannaisseur series is a monthly event series here in San Francisco. We do educational brunches, dinners, as well as workshops now too. All focusing on pairing and infusing low dose, both the meal and pairing with joints.
So when I get there in the beginning, do you actually choose different varieties and different strains to accompany each course? How does it work?
Definitely, yes. So we start off always with a welcome hour. You have past hors d'oeuvres that are low dose THC, and those are sativa focused, so more uplifting strains that have more of a limonene terpene. And then we move into a seated course. That's 4 courses where I infuse the courses with only the non-psychoactive parts, so things like the cannabis leaves, cannabinoids like CBD or THCA, as well as terpenes. And then in between each course, we do a joint pairing or a vape pairing. And that goes from a progression of sativa to CBD and then to indica at the end, which makes you feel really nice and toasty. You want to go home and go to sleep.
And how long? It sounds amazing. Yeah. I've yet to go to one. I hope I get to see one the next time in the Bay Area. How long do these dinners occur? What's
the dinners and the brunches are both 4-hour-long events. The workshops are a little bit shorter since it's teaching focused, instruction based focus, and so those are 2 hours.
So it's a long. There's a lot of time dilution in your meal. You would say, right?
Experience the entire time. We want to make you feel a certain way, and it feels pretty great. It's kind of like a roller coaster. We take you up and down and up and down.
Lovely. Have you gone to these meals, Stephanie? Are you a participant in them?
Yes,
definitely.
Yeah, they're just fantastic, and it was amazing. Last weekend, Coreen actually had one of her workshops, her first workshop, and it was her high valve
happy hour.
It was all about oysters and oyster tasting, and it was a real treat for me because I just love oysters.
Yes. And Stephanie's company Mellow has been a sponsor many of times where people get to try her delicious marshmallows that she produces here in this.
That was my next question, Stephanie. So Stephanie, you make very beautiful candies. Marshmallow candies, right?
Correct.
Who are your clients? Who do you make them for?
It's funny. When I first started Mellows, I thought that absolutely women would be like my target demographic, and they are. Women absolutely love our low dose treats, but interestingly enough, I do find that when I do my in-store demos and sampling events, really everyone loves them. Men, women. I mean, it's across the board. I guess people just want something that's delicious and delightful, and so it's been really fun. I mean, I think if we're talking about what a core audience is, a lot of people who are trying mellows for the first time are people who are new to cannabis and people who are kind of curious, who want that low dose or microdosers. So people who are more experienced, but they want to enjoy more than one piece, or they want to kind of just enjoy a piece throughout the day and feel elevated, but not totally stoned.
When you do in-store demonstrations, are you doing in the places like Bergdorf's? Like, where do you do that?
If only one day we'll be at
That's what I want to know. Yeah, I think that would really bring the people back to retail, back to the in-store experience, I think. But where do you do them?
We do them at dispensaries. So we'll have them at our retail partners at dispensaries, or we'll have them at special events like Emerald Cup or some of the cannabis events that are popping up.
Stephanie, stay with me for a second. You are Asian American, and traditionally, Asian Americans have been very, what's the word? Sort of resistant, shall we say, to cannabis and to most substances. In fact, I'm sure there's very good reasons for that historically. I know there are, but how do you talk to your family and your other family members about the fact that you just produced a book on edibles?
Sure. It's so funny. I did grow up in a pretty conservative Chinese American household, and never in a million years would I have thought I could, tell mom and dad, hey, I make weed candy for a living, but they've been amazingly supportive. And it's just so funny because there is such a history of herbal medicine in Chinese culture that it was a shock when I found that a lot of the Chinese community here in San Francisco was so resistant with the cannabis movement here. And, a large part of our goal with this book and with both of our businesses really is to destigmatize and normalize cannabis and really bring that kind of educational focus to the forefront and teach people, edibles aren't so scary. They can really be a great way for you to feel great, to not be stressed all the time, and to use it for medicinal purposes, whether it's for sleeping or for anxiety. But I think a lot of it has to do with education and really just normalizing it as plant medicine.
But how did the conversation go? Mom and Dad, I'm making weed candy. I want you to try it. What? Tell me how that went.
I mean, come on. So my dad was actually a huge hippie, and so he, lived on a commune in Italy for a number of years before moving to the United States. And so when he found out about it, he was like, "When can I try some?" He was pretty excited about it. My mom was a little more hesitant, and I think in the beginning it was kind of like a don't ask, don't tell. She was like, "Okay, you're making this and you're doing well, and I'm happy for you, but you're not really trying everything, are you?" And so it was kind of like, "Mom, you have to taste as you go when you cook." But I will say with the launch of the cookbook and for them it was great. They flew out from the East Coast and they were here for the book launch, and it was really special for them to see the celebrations of everything. And I think it really hit home with my mom, especially where she saw just the impact that that the book has on people and people's excitement for it, and just hearing stories. Hey, I'm buying this for my mom or my grandma, and I think it really legitimized a lot of it for her. And so, that made me feel really great just to see them. Yeah,
that's wonderful. So, Coreen, okay, let's give some tips here. So, what is the one indispensable tool for the cannabis kitchen that one must have? It could apply to any kitchen obviously.
Yeah, in edible making, the most important thing you need in a kitchen for sure is your scale. It always comes down to the grams, really. And if you want perfectly dosed edibles, you're going to need a scale to weigh out each piece and weigh out each part of your recipe. So that's definitely, without a doubt, the most important one that we use.
So what about implementation, actually putting this stuff together? What's the one instrument you really need to have close by all the time?
Outside of the scale,
Outside of the scale,
cannabis?
yeah. Is it a spatula? Is it a mixing bowl? Oil? Yeah.
I mean, you need the oil, you need cannabis, or the butter base. So, I mean, your cannabis flower, having good quality flower is without a doubt the other most important thing in terms of the ingredient. Whatever you make it's going to be from whatever it came from. So if you're starting off with good quality, you're going to have a good quality product in the end.
And do you guys make your own oils and butters, and is it necessary?
Oh, yes, definitely. I mean, that's how we start off all of the recipes. So in the cookbook, we give you 3 main base recipes, one for alcohol, one for oil, it's a coconut oil, and then one for a clarified butter, which we also show you how to do a sous vide section so it's not as smelly. But those are the base recipes that we then carry on into other recipes. We also show you how to make a honey and a maple syrup out of that. And then we have 30 recipes in the cookbook, and they all kind of use some form of formulation of those 5.
On a scale of 1 to 10, how easy is it to make cannabis butter?
Actually, pretty easy. It's not a lot. It's more time consuming than anything, but it's not a lot of work. It's pretty straightforward. There's a few steps you have to go through, but I think anybody that can boil water could do it.
And Stephanie, what's your favorite recipe out of this cookbook? Come on, I know you have to commit to one. It could be a marshmallow. It could be a mellow. It's okay. You can be completely self-promoting.
I know. Well,
be my guest.
Other than the marshmallows, because I think I have to say that. I actually I'm really proud of our grapefruit Negroni pot de fouille candies in here. If you aren't familiar with, normally, so they're called pat de fouille. It's basically a French way of saying a fancy gummy candy. And typically you'll see them in a lot of fruit flavors like strawberry or, other kinds of, I've actually had some really delicious guava pot de fouilles before, but Coreen and I both really love Negronis. And so when we were looking at playing with different flavor profiles, we wanted to do something around that. And so we paired it with some grapefruit for it's just a nice, real bright flavor there. And I just love them because they're beautiful. I mean, they are just super brilliant, and they get coated in this. We use a raw sugar that's infused with juniper berries to kind of, tip our hat to the gin component of the cocktail. And they're just a nice punch of flavor, and they're just so pretty. They make a great gift, and people are always just, completely knocked over when they see how gorgeous they are. So I'm super proud of that one. I think that they're one of my favorite things in the book.
They're like cute little jewels.
Yeah, they're beautiful.
They're just so pretty to look at.
They are gorgeous. And speaking of gifts, I want to say to everybody, listen, the book is called Edibles, Small Bite for the Modern Cannabis Kitchen. And this does make a great gift. It's $19.95. It's published by Chronicle Books. And our 2 authors who we've just spoken to are Stephanie Hua and Coreen Carroll. Women of Weed, thank you very much. Have a lovely
Wonderful.
holiday.
You as well. Happy holidays.
Joe, before that little segment, you said that it was a great potential Christmas gift for your cannabis enthusiasts that might be in your life. And I tend to agree. I think that that's a great way to spread the word of cannabis without taking any silly risks of trying to mail things illegally through the mail. Books are definitely a way to go. And this book that we're about to talk about next is something that you have literally beat the ground over and over about on our podcast about being a huge fan of Stealing Fire.
Well, I love Stealing Fire. I recommend it to everyone I know. And we spoke to one of the co-authors, Jamie Wheal, a few episodes ago, and I love the interview. And his partner, his co-writer in that is called Stephen Kotler. And Stephen, we have both been writers for many years. Our careers sort of tracked along the same lines. But he has really stepped out into this world of looking at optimal performance through using various substances. And actually anandamide, which is the substance that is the body's version of THC, is one of those substances. So he has a lot to say about hacking our flow states with various substances. And this episode is about hacking the flow state with cannabis. It's a high performance cocktail that I think we should all be aware of.
Thank you again for joining us on the Brave New Weed podcast. It is a pleasure to talk to you. I want to, before we begin, I just want to fill the listeners in on your project, what you're working on, what's meaningful to you right now. I'm thinking about the Flow Genome Project. I'm thinking about a few things. So just give us a quick overview because you can do it better than I can.
Well, what's meaningful to me right now, I'm in the middle of a couple of new books, 3 of them. One's coming out in May, and I'm in the middle of writing. So that's always fun and all-consuming, as you know.
It is not fun. It is not fun. Don't tell me it's fun. Don't tell me you're in flow on these books already.
Sometimes. I'm writing. One of them is a collaboration with Peter Diamandis, and I really love writing with Peter. But I found that it's much harder to get into flow on collaborations. For me, at least. So that, a little trickier. But yeah, I have a pretty good track record with flow in writing at this point. The Flow Genome Project is doing some really cool research. Our research arm is really getting up and moving, and that's really got a lot of my attention right now.
Give me the 30 seconds on the Flow Genome Project for the listeners, really.
Flow Genome Project is a research and training project. I think we're the largest open source research and training peak performance program in the world. Sorry, I'm having trouble with nouns, verbs, and adjectives today, apparently. So we study peak performance, specifically focusing on the state of consciousness known to flow. And for the readers or listeners who aren't familiar with flow, it's technically defined as an optimal state of consciousness, right? One where we feel our best and we perform our best. And more specifically, it's those moments of kind of rapt attention and total absorption. We get so focused on the task at hand that everything else just kind of disappears, and all aspects of performance, both mental and physical, go through the roof. So I work on the neurobiology of that. Where does it come from? How do we get more of it? How can you use it to our advantage? How can we use it as individuals and organizations, as institutions, all that sort of stuff.
And that's where our interest in talking together arises, basically, because as I've read your books, I keep seeing a number of 6 brain chemicals that really are the basis of this state, which you'll elucidate for us, one of which is anandamide, which comes from cannabis. So I never really thought that anandamide or cannabinoids had a lot to do with flow, but I'm wrong, aren't I?
You are wrong, and in an interesting, still mysterious, and still not quite understood completely as well as we'd like ways. And so I want to back up 1/2 a second, because while you're totally correct, those big 6 neurochemicals that Jamie Wheal and myself write about in Stealing Fire, norepinephrine, dopamine, serotonin, anandamide, endorphins, and oxytocin. They do tend to underpin flow states. They underpin most of kind of what I call the north of happy experiences, which is all the states of consciousness that sort of stretch from awe and meditative states and contemplative states on one side, all the way to kind of flow states and psychedelic states and so-called mystical experiences like out-of-body or near-death experiences, those sorts of things. They tend to show up across the boards, and we also see changes in neural anatomical function and brain waves and things like that, which I'm not going to go into. I just have to do that as preamble.
Yes, you did. Thank you.
I'm sorry.
Thank you for that preamble.
Yeah,
I'm exhausted. There's a lot of big words.
Yeah, I know. I apologize. Anandamide's interesting because it is work done by Arne Dietrich, who was at Georgia Tech when he was doing this work. He's not there anymore, but he found anandamide in runner's high as sort of the core chemical at runner's high. And he did it at a time that what's known as the endorphin hypothesis, the idea that runner's high and kind of the uplifting portions of flow states are caused by endorphins, which is they do show up in flow states, but there was a period of time where we didn't know that was true. And that's when this research was done. So we also discovered that anandamide definitely shows up in kind of athletically induced flow states. For sure. And it seems more and more proof that it shows up during creatively induced flow states, the flow states that middle managers get into when they're at work and conversation, all that sort of stuff seems to show up as well. But there's a lot more work to be done.
So, so that's interesting on two levels. The first question is, cannabis is typically mythically or fake newsedly associated with a lot of laziness, and you just said it has to do with it's somehow involved in peak performance. Can you talk to that a little bit, please?
Yeah, it's one of the kind of the great mistakes people make about cannabis. And I learned this originally from Rick Doblin, who runs MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Research. And, they've been very, very, very involved in, everything from MDMA for PTSD and psilocybin and LSD for end of life. But they've also been involved in cannabis research for a while. And Rick pointed out to me that cannabis produces state-dependent learning. And you've heard of state-dependent learning. It's the idea that if you study for the SATs in purple sweats, you take them in purple sweats. And it actually extends farther than that. But the real thing here with marijuana is when most people are exposed to marijuana for the first time, what they do is they're in high school and they sit on the couch with their friends and they laugh and they eat Cheetos and they watch movies. And they're nothing if not lazy. And that is training the brain to be lazy while stoned. But Rick introduced me to cannabis when I was coming back from Lyme disease. And, I had used surfing and flow states and a bunch of other things to sort of get my health back to about 80%. And I couldn't get from 80% back up to 100%. I was trying everything. And my biggest problem was I couldn't focus at all. It was shot. Maybe 2 hours a day of work was all I could do. And I was talking to Rick and he suggested cannabis. And at the time I laughed at him. I was like, dude, my problem is I can't focus. This is the exact wrong thing. He said, no, you're doing it wrong. And he put me on a program where I would use very small doses of sativa. And sativa was very important because it's got the dopamine boost on the front end, which not only increases focus, but it also, there's energy there. And it really worked. It took my ability to write and focus and work from 2 hours a day up to 4 and then 8, and really sort of helped me get my career back after that. But I had to, in the beginning, at least for probably the first 6 months to a year, I didn't do anything other than write while I was using cannabis. So I was just training myself to focus on cannabis. So that's one half of the story, right? State-dependent learning. The other half comes from a story that was told to me by Mitch Earlywine, who is a long-standing cannabis researcher, used to be at USC. Now I think he's in Kentucky. Is that correct? I think you know him too.
I think so, yes.
Yeah. So Mitch was pointing out that when they measure reaction times, it's done by a light board, right? A giant tic-tac-toe board, and a square lights up and you swat it. And then 2 squares light up in order and you swat those in order. And if you put stone guy next to sober guy and you light up 1 square, sober guy wins. And if you light up 2 squares, sober guy wins. And if you light up 3 squares, they sort of start to tie. And at 4 squares, sober guy might actually even be pulling ahead. And by 5 squares, sober guy's probably going to pull ahead.
Sober guy or stone guy?
Stone guy.
Got it.
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Totally up. Sober guy will pull ahead till about 3, and then stone guy tends to pull ahead after that. And the reason has to do with something else that kind of altered states of consciousness do, and this includes cannabis, which is it shuts down kind of portions of your prefrontal cortex, the kind of executive functions of the brain. And when you're dealing with really complicated patterns, right? It's fine if you're trying to hold 3 things in your brain at once, like these 3 squares, that works just fine. You can do that in your working memory, in your short-term memory. But once you get to more complicated patterns, the short-term memory, most of us tap out after about 4 items, right? Then you have to do that effectively, you have to pass that over sort of to the subconscious, turn off that portion of the brain and let the senses take in the information and let the subconscious follow the pattern, which that happens all the time, by the way. We do that in imitation. We do that in learning through doing. That's not uncommon. It's just difficult to do on command. Marijuana allows us to do it. So that's why in action sports, for example, you see tons of athletes using cannabis as a performance-enhancing drug. And there's a long, long, long history here. In fact, that's the grounds for some of the work we're doing at the Flow Genome Project, because there's a lot of, out of the action sports community and anecdotally, there's a tremendous amount of evidence, basically, that they talk about in action sports the Hippie Speedball, which is about 25 minutes of exercise, which is about what it takes to turn off the prefrontal cortex, by the way, to get that quiet, and possibly to even start introducing a little anandamide in the system. And you follow that with a cup of coffee, and then you follow that with marijuana. It has to be sativa. And that combination, neurobiologically, it's very close to a flow state. So it's one of the kind of cheapest flow hacks in the world. Doesn't work all the time, doesn't work every day, but it's very well utilized in action sports. So we're now looking at cannabis and saying, okay, one, can we prove that there's a relationship between cannabis and flow? And two, what's the best way to get at that relationship? Do you want sativa? Do you want indica? Do you want a hybrid? What are the terpenes? What are the blah, blah, blah? All that stuff. We're starting to ask those questions. Basically, how can we combine cannabis and flow for kind of a high performance cocktail? Is it even possible? What would it look like? What is there a formula? Is it going to differ person to person? All those kinds of questions. We're at the very front end of just starting to ask those questions, but I'm really excited. I think these are the kind of questions I've been wanting to ask about flow and altered states of consciousness for a very, very long time. And we're finally
I want to know everything about the ingredients of that high performance cocktail. So let me ask you a little more deeply here. Do we know, is it intense exercise or relaxed exercise?
So for the cocktail I just gave you,
yes,
what we've seen, and we have not researched this, right?
Understood. But it sounds about right to me.
That said, what we've seen so the real answer is this, by the way. If you're skiing, right, and you want to get into a flow state while skiing, just do a couple of warm-up laps. Don't get really, really aggressive until you've already kicked into flow. Low grade to medium grade exercise seems to be sort of what works best there. We know, like for various other flow activities, when you're trying to use this stuff, we tell people not to exhaust themselves, right? Let's say I want to get into flow for writing. I will go take my dogs for like a 25-minute hike, come home, drink a cup of coffee, and smoke a joint. Right, that'll mimic it, and it's a low grade activity. The reason is I don't want to exhaust my brain because I want the flow state for writing, right? And so I don't want to run myself into the ground, and because then the cup of coffee is not going to pick me up. My brain's going to be too tired.
That's right. Totally makes sense. So another question is the terpenes you're talking about. You keep talking about sativa.
But what we know right now, and the reason I keep saying sativa has nothing to do with the kind of individual variation you get with the terpenes. I'm specifically talking about dopamine. And that's also, by the way, why people have a very hard time not getting paranoid when they use sativas. It's because of the dopamine, because one of the things dopamine does is it fires up the brain's pattern recognition system. It makes it go really, really fast. And that way, it's just finding links between anything. And if your attention happens to land on something negative, it's going to really move in that direction quickly. So you need a little bit of self-control to avoid that.
Oh, that's so interesting. I didn't know it was dopamine related. So when you say sativa, though, my mind automatically trips to limonene. Like, give me limonene and perhaps a little pinene. These are the two terpenes in cannabis that are really associated with that sort of fast gun burst thinking. Gun word.
And we may find out, right? We may find out that it's the terpenes that are directly triggering the production of dopamine.
What everybody thinks. They always say the terpenes are what's driving the quality of the high, which I think sounds about right to me, I have to say. Because if you're using a cannabis that has 15% THC, that high can be tremendously different across varieties, right? It's not about the THC content. It seems to be about these other factors. But the third part of my question is dosage. It seems to me that dose is key to this, to keeping in a flow state. Are you talking about a high dose? You said come back and smoke a joint. If I smoked a joint of what's floating on the street these days, my flow state would be in bed. I'd be
exactly.
I'd be flowing in bed. Okay.
Yeah, some of it, dose dependent upon what you're used to, right?
Uh-huh.
You want I mean, what you're aiming for is that state where your brain is fired up, where it's going from idea to idea, where the anandamide has kind of expanded lateral thinking, and you're really in that zone, right? That's what you're going for, but you don't want to knock yourself, too far. So you want, you still want use of your conscious faculties. And that's strain to strain, person to person, and, heavily dependent on how much cannabis you use and how much practice you have.
This is why I like using low dose edibles, because they're much more measurable in a way. Like, there's these things called Satori chocolates that I can get in California. Perhaps you can get them in Colorado, and they dose them in 1 to 5, maybe 7 or 8, I can't remember, milligrams of THC per candy. So you can literally take a 2 milligram candy, chocolate, very nice tasting chocolate, by the way, and really have like a very low lift. It's barely an enhancement, and yet feel a little bit energized, for a couple of hours. It's not like powering up. It's just like turning up the wattage a bit. Have you experimented with those, Stephen?
So, strange thing about me, and this is genetic. So, in psychedelic literature, there's a term that they use called a hardhead. Hardhead is basically somebody you got to give large quantities of psychedelics to get a real impact. The term doesn't just apply across psychedelics. It sort of goes across the board pharmacologically. So, for example, I've had quite a bit of surgery, and when I go to have surgery, I have to tell the doctor that morphine and opiates are not going to work on me. And if they give me the normal standard dose of opiates, I'm going to come out of the surgery screaming, which I've done. My mother has the exact same issue. So whatever it is, it's genetic, it's being passed down. So I tend to, this, and by the way, like, this was really advantageous in high school because I was the guy who had to talk to the cops and kept everybody out of jail whenever trouble started, because I was always really sober, unfortunately. So I think I'm and by the way, Joe, I have to tell you, I think this is one of the reasons flow is especially at the high end, flow is a spectrum experience, right? We've talked about this before, me and you, like, that it stretches from the low end of micro flow all the way up to this macro flow experience. And in micro flow has core characteristics: complete concentration in the present moment, the vanishing of self, time passing strangely, a couple others. In microflow, they're very, very low. In macroflow, they're very, very loud. And most people thought they were looking at a quote unquote mystical experience until the 1950s and Abraham Maslow came along. They really thought flow was mostly a religious, spiritual, mystical experience. That changed in the 50s when we started to understand the neurobiology underneath it and things like that. But the reason I bring all this up is I'm a hardhead in all experiences. I think I'm a good flow researcher because macro flow is such a dramatic shift in consciousness. I notice it.
Got it.
So I think I have to work a little harder than most people. So I think what I'm trying to say politely is that your dosing wouldn't work for me at all.
It's too low for you.
Yeah.
It's too low for you. Interesting. One of the things I love about your work and your work with Jamie is that you talk about these states that are typically, they are regarded as spiritual / mystical experiences, but you've sort of stripped religion away from it, which really much appeals to me. I'm not a religious person. It doesn't appeal to me in the slightest, having been raised a good Catholic boy or a bad Catholic boy. But when you take away religion from these ecstatic experiences, what's left? How can you talk about it? How can you measure it for those who haven't read your work?
So there's a bunch of different ways. And let me start big and get more granular as we go along. Because the first thing I want to point out is, while I tend to, I'm more of an agnostic than an atheist. I think I think the universe is just bigger than I can understand, and I'm happy to keep a little bit of the mystery in the mystery. That doesn't bother me. I don't have to have all the answers. I like not having all the answers. But what I always say is, what we've done over the past 30 years in science is really mapped pretty much every so-called mystical experience that you've ever heard of we understand neurobiologically. Now, I'm not saying there aren't things that show up in these experiences that we can explain. That happens all the time. There's stuff that happens where we can't get there yet. I would tend to argue that's because our measurement technology is not there yet, but open to other interpretations. My point about all this is it doesn't answer any of the big questions, right? It tells us nothing philosophically about whether or not Sky Dad exists or doesn't exist, right?
That's right.
All we know is we are neurobiologically hardwired for these experiences. And more importantly, and this is a fact that dates back to William James was the first person to point this out, over 100 years ago. And it remains very true today, which is on the other side of these experiences, whatever causes them, people are profoundly different. They are changed. They are happier. They are more content. They have more life satisfaction. Their health improves, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it has gotten to the point that we know that these experiences permanently change the brain. This was really fantastic research done by a woman named Willoughby Britton. She's now at Brown, but she was at the University of Arizona where she did some of that work. So we know all those things are true. We just don't know, it could mean anything. Now, again, long way of saying the way we talk about these experiences, and this is, in the altered state spectrum, the north of happiness spectrum, the ecstatic spectrum, what's technically called, that I was talking about earlier. What's interesting about all these experiences, not only do they share underlying neurobiology, they share underlying phenomenology, meaning they make us feel the same way. So all of these experiences do four things to us. The first is they're selfless experiences. The reason being the portion of the brain, the prefrontal cortex that generates our sense of self, is turned off during these experiences. They're also timeless, which means the same thing, same cause. The portion of our brain, our prefrontal cortex that is charged with sort of calculating time, that network goes down in these states of consciousness. The next thing that they are is they're effortless, which is to say, when we're in these states, it feels like we're being moved by a force that is greater than ourselves.
Absolutely,
right?
yes.
What that force really is, for those who want to be, as cynical as you could possibly be, is the power and the potency of pleasure chemistry, right? The 5 chemicals we've been talking about, they all have enormous performance-enhancing qualities, but they're also pleasure drugs. In fact, they're the 5 most potent pleasure drugs the brain can produce. And flow and some of these other experiences are about the only time we get access to all 5 simultaneously. And so it feels like effortless effort, right? We're being pushed by like the very reward systems that evolution designed to drive behavior, and we're getting all 5 at once. And finally, these experiences are information rich, which is a very fancy way of saying that when we're in these experiences, for neurobiological reasons, they essentially surround all of the brain's information processing machinery. So we take in more information per second, we process it more quickly, we find faster patterns between that incoming information, lateral thinking goes up, so we find faster patterns and more far-flung patterns, et cetera, et cetera. So all that stuff gets really sped up, and we have, in these states, access to really high-quality information that we don't seem to get access to under normal conditions. So that's one way we can talk about these states of consciousness, these 4 kind of underlying phenomenological characteristics. And by the way, there are a lot of other people who came up with different scales and different ways to kind of measure altered states. We settled on these 4 because almost every other researcher who's come along has sort of anchored, they haven't anchored their categories in neurobiology, and they've usually anchored them culturally. So if you go back to like the 60s, right, when LSD was first happening, and there was a lot of talk about rebirthing, reincarnation and rebirthing, right? Like the early psychedelic measures, they've all got these like crazy measures of, did you come through the birth tunnel and experience, you know what I mean? And they're just like weighed down by this cultural baggage that is of a time. So we tried to get at 4 things that are not of a time, that are linked directly to the neurobiological changes underneath the mechanism and seem to remain stable.
No, listen, I love that. I love that framework. And I also want to say that I agree with you. It's very important to keep mystery and surprise alive. And I am not at all advocating for a purely data-driven world. I don't think it's a very rich world at the end of the day. So I just want to say that.
Yeah, and Jamie always pokes at me and calls me massively reductionistic, and I am, except for the fact that like I'm only talking about one scale, right? I'm talking about the scale that's taking place in the brain, and that's just a very thin slice of everything that's going on, and it's just our best guess at what mechanism is right now, right?
I take your point. Yeah, I totally take your point. I want to go back to this idea of microdosing for a second. I mean, we haven't really talked about it, but obviously so many people are talking about microdosing, primarily with either psilocybin or LSD today. And yet I have found, as we've discussed, because of my own tolerance levels, probably some great states that are available in microdosing with cannabis. Have you experimented with this? Have you experimented with psychedelic microdosing? Is there a parallel you would draw?
So, yeah, let me work my way down to the question, because when Jamie and I were writing Stealing Fire, each of us had one of those. Stealing Fire is a book about kind of the expanding revolution in people utilizing altered states of consciousness, sort of the entire ecstatic spectrum, to massively up-level high performance. And we're talking at every level of society. And Jamie had this eye-opening experience that involved the Navy SEALs and some of the stuff they were doing. For me, we were talking to a senior engineer at a major tech company who's going to go unnamed, but let's just say they're big and you probably interact with their technology
every single day.
Okay. So one of those, and he was like, look, we were talking about we had just presented on Flow, and the guy pulled us aside. He's like, yeah, this Flow stuff, it's great, but my whole team, we're microdosing at a regular basis at work. And then we're doing heroic doses of LSD a couple times a year offsite to enhance our creativity and our focus and our productivity and our performance. And I was gobsmacked. It was, at work, psychedelics, technology. It means that a technology I interact with every day is being direct. I know my history of computers, and I know how much of a role psychedelics have played. But this is like a daily touch point that I think is really interesting. So that's, that side of the coin. And for certain, James Fadiman has done fantastic research that goes literally back to the 60s and the moment the research got shut down the first time, on how, in his studies, I think the average is that microdosing increases creativity and really complex problem solving by 200%. Mm-hmm. So that's a huge change. Personal experience, I have tried microdosing 3 different times with psilocybin, and it makes me irritable and it makes me stupid. I have found that does not work for me at all. Microdosing cannabis, I have found is really good for anxiety for me. Mm-hmm. I have not found it does much for performance, but I have found it really works well for anxiety.
Interesting. I was speaking to a researcher a couple of months ago who was saying that cannabinoids, or certain terpenes, I can't recall exactly, hit a different point on the receptor, but a similar point on a receptor, which also triggers anxiety. And he said, and I think this is much to be discovered here, though, but that anxiety is essential to creativity. And it's because of this receptor stimulation. Have you ever heard of anything like that?
Well, so it's a very weird point, and I'll tell you why. And I'm not saying
and creativity are absolutely tied in, right?
What we know. So this is the first thing to know is that. So let's talk sympathetic. There's a sympathetic nervous system response is your fight or flight response. It's heavy anxiety, right? Parasympathetic calms that down. It's anti-anxiety. But in flow, what the data is showing is not that the fight or flight response is turning off. Instead, we're seeing both systems activated at once because it allows you to fine tune the state. much, much more. It gives the brain much better fine-tuning capabilities.
That is so interesting, huh?
So on that level, I'm saying maybe some of that is going on. But the other thing I really want to point out here is what we know is that the size of the database searched by the pattern recognition system, meaning how far out it can go, how much latent inhibition there is, meaning how long you can hold on to an idea before you attach meaning to it. The longer you can sort of hold it in your head, the farther flung connections the brain can find. That's how you get outside the box thinking, right? Those kinds of things. You also have to have those networks fired up a little bit as well. But norepinephrine and cortisol, but specifically norepinephrine, shrinks, which is anxiety, shrinks the size of that database. And the extreme example is fight or flight. In fight or flight, you don't get to make any decisions. You are given 2 or 3 options. You can fight, you can flee, or you can freeze. And freezing is actually what happens when you get both signals at the same time, right? So it's your brain screwing up in a moment of panic. So you get, that's why, one of the things that happens in flow is a lot of the stress hormones get flushed out of your system. You still obviously have some of them both working at once because it gives you exactitude. But yeah, I could see, yes, you want a little bit of norepinephrine in the system. And I'll give you an example. As a writer, you know this. If I say, Joe, I need you to do 3,000 words on consciousness, you could go anywhere, and that's a bitch of an article to write. But if I come to you and I say, Joe, hey, I want you to do 3,000 words on how David Eagleman's new research on brain perception is shaping our understanding of consciousness, well, suddenly, right, there's limitations, right? Maybe a little anxiety that comes with those limitations, but you know what you're doing a little bit more. It's a bad example because there were too many other factors in it, but I'm trying to get there. I don't know.
I need to put a limit on everything to feel creative. Like the way as a writer, what I do is I like to put a headline on something almost before I even write it. The headline can change, but it really helps me to know that I'm not writing about X, Y, and Z. I'm only focusing on this little slice of something. And that does, again, that to me is expertise in a way. It's like this, the narrower you can do it. I don't know what I'm talking about. I give up. But it's very interesting. And I think the way you describe that fight or flight and that relationship to anxiety, it's really interesting. I mean, I used to want to abolish anxiety, but now I think it's you have to manage it. You have to tame it. You have to get very friendly with it to really help it work for you. At least I do, for me.
I've always said that every really successful person I've ever met, and definitely every person I've ever met who has really accomplished something hard, something impossible, they're all running from something just as fast as they're running towards something. And there's a reason.
Right? Every day, every minute of every day, yeah.
You need the double motivation. It is hard to do hard things. And fear is an amazing motivator. It gives you focus for free. Right? You get a little bit of focus. When you're scared of something, you're paying attention automatically. So performance, if you can learn to manage it, work with it, negotiate with it, all that stuff. And neurobiologically, anxiety and excitement, they're the exact same signal, by the way. Norepinephrine is also excitement, which is why this is a funny experiment. This is my favorite example of this. They did a study at Harvard. They wanted to know what worked faster to calm people down, if they tried to reframe anxiety as excitement, or if they used meditation and breath work to kind of quiet down anxiety. And they found that using meditation and breath work to quiet down anxiety takes, around 7 to 13 minutes kind of thing to get any kind of real reaction. But you can literally, with reframing, you can think about the thing that scares you and the feeling of it, and say out loud, I am excited, I am excited, I am excited 3 times in a row while feeling that feeling. And a good chunk of the time, it automatically just turns into excitement because the signaling is the same. And all that changes is the frame we build around the signal.
Wow. That's fascinating. Hey, Stephen, if I want to know more about the Flow or the Flow Genome Project, if I want to take a workshop with you guys or do something like that, where do I go to find out? Where do we learn?
flowgenomeproject.com. FLOWGENOME project, PROJECT.com. Anything you want. Check out the video.
Are you doing any experiential workshops? Are you doing any programs that people can participate in?
December, I don't know when this is coming out. The next one I do, early December, and roughly every 6 months, I do a Flow for Writers, a 2-day deep dive for writers and creatives and anybody who are sort of working professionally with words. And we do all kinds of other stuff. We do a couple of times a year. We do big first-person gatherings. We call them flow camps. We do flow and snow events, sometimes with skiing involved. We have all kinds of digital trainings, and we work with a lot of different organizations. So we spend a lot of time, speaking with corporations and training up corporations and things like that as well.
Yes, please.
So there's lots of different ways to interact.
Get corporate America up to speed in Flow, because we really need them there. So again, I want to thank you.
I got to tell you something. You laugh, but let's talk about that for half a second, because here's the thing, really worth saying on that one. So McKinsey did a 10-year study, and they found top executives in Flow are 500% more productive than out of Flow. So that means if you spend 2 days a week in Flow, you're going to be 1,000% more productive than the competition. The Flow Genome Project, my organization, a lot of other people's organizations, we're getting better and better and better and better at training Flow. We really are. And we're already working with hundreds of corporations already. And other people are as well. So people are getting trained up in this. And one of the reasons I think it's so important is the brain does not process speed and scale very well. We do it when we're in Flow, but under normal conditions, we don't do it so well. And we live in a massively accelerated world because of exponentially growing technology right now. And Flow is really one of the only ways cognitively we can keep up. And I think it's going to be going forward. I think it actually is going to be a real dividing line in corporate America.
I'm not being sarcastic. I actually mean it. I think we need it, but I also think we need to sort of flow up maybe the Democratic Party too, so we can keep things moving in the right direction a little bit.
Yeah, flow and politics is an interesting. I'm dying to interview Obama about Flow in the White House, because he's a guy who's going to be able to have the conversation. He's a basketball player. He's one of the greatest orators in history. Yeah. And I want to talk about Flow. I want to know if there was any Flow in the White House.
Okay, I'm sure there isn't much now, but before we go there, let's stop this interview because It's been fantastic. I hope to speak to you again. I know you're on the road for a couple of months. I wish you safe travels. Get out there and flow the world, Stephen.
Thank you, Joe. Fun dogging you.
If you would like to be the first to know what Brave New Weed is up to, you can join our mailing list. Visit bravenewweed.com and sign up today.
Matthew, Stephen, that is the kind of interview that I just want to keep doing more of, because we're not hearing that sort of talk. We're not hearing these kind of conversations in the mainstream media. It's just, it's not present in our lives. And allow me, before we sign off, to make a pitch to our listeners that, guys, we are bringing you conversations that are not commonly heard in the media, not commonly heard anywhere, really. And we want to keep doing it. And we want to keep doing it on our own terms. We don't want to have to be compromised. And the way we do that is through your support. Every time we ask people to support us, we get more support through Patreon. People are coming on. They're understanding that we really have to pay for the media and for the information that we want. At this point, attention is a limited resource in the world. And there's so much coming at us. We have to be mindful of what we listen to, who we listen to. We have to be mindful of what information we're taking in. We are the sum of what we pay attention to. And at this point in life, there's so much coming at us that it only makes sense that we're going to have to choose very carefully and then pay for the things that we value. So I have made it my business this year to be sure that I support the podcasts, the newspapers, the television stations, the public broadcasting, that really matters to me, where I get information that I know is truthful, not truthy, and that is informing me of things that I'm just not getting through the mainstream, that I'm not hearing on the everyday channels. So I want to encourage you to please, 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 if you have an extra few dollars a month, and only if you have a few extra dollars a month, don't listen to this at all if you're just getting by, okay? But if you have a few extra dollars a month, please consider supporting us through Patreon. We want to keep doing this. We do it for love. We don't do it for money. But your few pennies and dollars will really help us keep the lights going and make sure that we keep coming to you.
Yeah, that's right. Listeners, we really appreciate everything that you've done for us so far. We love hearing from you, and we absolutely love getting your support. So as Joe said, if you want to come on and become a partner of the show, please visit patreon.com/bravenewweed and become a Patreon patron of the show today.
Thank you very much for tuning in. Next episode is called Ask Me Anything. Our guest will be Dr. Sunil Agarwal, one of the brightest lights in cannabis research. And we've compiled all of the questions that listeners have sent us over the year and put them to Sunil. And you can tune in and find the answers to them. It's a really enlightening episode, and he's a great speaker.
Man, I'm such a fan of Dr. Agarwal on Twitter. He's one of the first pages that I check anytime I log on, so I am super excited to hear his answers to all of our listeners.
Yeah, he is a broad thinker and just a smart guy. I love him. So it's a great I know it's going to be a great episode. Please tune in.
And it'll come out right after Christmas as our Christmas gift to all of you.
Aw. See you, Matthew.
Cheers, Joe.
Thanks for listening to the Brave New Weed podcast. This episode and all future episodes are made possible by amazing listeners like yourself. If you like what you've heard, we encourage you to show your support by giving $1 a month for special access and rewards on patreon.com/bravenewweed. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram via @bravenewweed. Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/bravenewweed. And remember, you can always find more information about us or information discussed in each episode by pointing your favorite browser to bravenewweed.com.